So welcome to our first installment of this new series for the European Conservative, where we will be discussing the history of European thought and philosophy with academics. And first out, we have a very interesting speaker, David Lloyd Dusenbury, who is a philosopher and historian of ideas. He's senior fellow at the Danube Institute, visiting professor at Eötvös Loránd University in Hungary, and he has a forthcoming book with Hurst in London next year on the Samizdat philosophy of Jan Patočka, who we will be discussing today, especially this wonderful text, Plato and Europe. So welcome, David. Could you please tell us a bit about how you came across Patočka first and introduce us into his life a bit?
Well, my own introduction to, by the way, it's such a pleasure to be here. It goes without saying, but my own introduction to Patočka came by way of Jacques Derrida. So one of Derrida's late works opens with quite a sustained and I would say, having revisited it at after a 20-year interval, a very interesting and a very serious reflection reading of Patočka, called something along the lines of Jan Patočka and the Secret of European Responsibility. So one of the things that is, I think, intriguing for you and me about Derrida's reading is that he really sees that something about the impulse of Patočka's whole project is Christian in some way, or is fundamentally sort of mediated by the Christian legacy, which we can discuss more. So really, it was this this chapter of a longer meditation by Derrida in the roughly 20-25 years ago that led me to Plato and Europe, which is the marvelous lecture series you've already displayed, and which I've recently been revisiting in the process of working on this new book on Patočka. I suppose I could only add that really it was my invitation to the Danube Institute a couple of years ago, which sort of brought Patočka back to mind as one of the most influential, but also I think one of the most serious and accomplished Central European philosophers of the late 20th century. Having been in Budapest for a while now, I would add that there are some other really quite remarkable Hungarian philosophers. One I can perhaps briefly mention because I'm such a fan of his, but a fellow named Laszlo Fuldenyi. The title alone of this book, I think, is worth the book. But Laszlo Fuldenyi is a contemporary philosopher living and working in Budapest, and I think he's worthy of mention as well, even though we're here to talk Patočka.
So could you tell us a bit about who he was and perhaps also who he was reading? We know that he was in the tradition of phenomenology, but who specifically influenced him to write what later became Plato in Europe and his heretical essays?
Well, there are scholars far more steeped in the Patočka archive than I am. So really kind of the task I've set myself in the book I'm working on at the moment is just to present a sort of synthetic reading, hopefully fresh synthetic reading of his two last great works, both of which, to use your word, are samizdat. So they were printed in clandestine circumstances and distributed in very kind of circumspect ways in the late period of Soviet-governed Prague. So one is heretical essays and the other is Plato and Europe. And these two kind of, one is a series of essays, the other is a series of lectures, but they sort of belong together in ways which are not immediately clear. And certainly there's never been a reading of them in conjunction in English. So I'm definitely attempting something original in English, but to my awareness, there's no such reading in, let's say, French or Czech either. Okay. So the influences really seem to be very diverse. I mean, he talks a good bit about Comte in the latter part of Plato in Europe. Comte has a special significance for him. You've already mentioned both Husserl and Heidegger, whom I see as his primary impulses. But really, I mean, I think it's worth saying, Karl, that so much of what is of interest in Plato in Europe is the fact that Patočka himself, with his own concerns and preoccupations, which are informed by phenomenology, but nevertheless, which are kind of his own, Patočka is going back to the Greeks, and he's spending a lot of time rereading Plato, rereading the pre-Socratics with some of his peculiar questions of the soul and freedom and kind of the essence of truth in mind. And so part of what's exciting to me about Patočka is that for someone like myself who spent quite a lot of time reading Heidegger and Husserl and a fair bit of time, reading the Greeks, nevertheless, when I read Patočka on these ancient texts, I feel like new things are happening, new dimensions are being explored, and so I hope I haven't disappointed you, but I guess I'm trying to stress his originality rather than so much his influences. I guess I could add one presence which I'm quite intrigued by is Hegel. Hegel is definitely, because Patočka believes that history is ultimately about the disclosure of truth in a grand sense. This is extremely Hegelian, but one of the things that separates Patočka from Hegel and Marx and much of the Hegelian tradition is his insistence on freedom, which I think places him more in the Kantian camp. But I would just say that even though Hegel seems to be very much in the air, he's a name that you almost never encounter in Patočka.
Following on from that, could you say something about the circumstances of his own life which might have led him to think so much about the concept of freedom? He was, of course, working in a time of totalitarian regime in his native Prague. Could you expand a bit on that?
Yes, well, as you say, he studied with Husserl at a very difficult time in Husserl's life. So, as some of our listeners might already know, Husserl was sort of the master thinker who brought Heidegger into position at a critical time in Germany's history. Heidegger turned on his master and really treated him abominably in the early 30s, and which I think is something which should definitely not be forgotten. So this is exactly the time when Patočka was in Germany to study with Husserl, who, it's worth mentioning, was himself Czech by birth. So they regarded each other as kind of fellow Czechs in Germany. And but nevertheless, Heidegger was such an imposing thinker that while Patočka was studying with Husserl, he sort of crossed the aisle regularly and listened to Heidegger's lectures as well. So it was on his kind of return to Prague that a series of really very profoundly troubling and disruptive developments occurred. You had first the kind of Nazi control of Prague, followed by the Soviet control of Prague. And Patočka sort of seems to have consistently, just as he kind of refused to be neatly fit into either a Husserlian or Heideggerian camp, as I was just saying, he kind of absolutely refused to be politically co-opted during either of these totalitarian periods. The second of which killed him. He died in 1977 after a police interrogation by the Czech state police. So he survived the Nazi period. He did not survive the communist. But nevertheless, it seems that in both cases, he was really a principled thinker. And again, I think his principled stance in both of these extremely difficult times was rooted in his return to the Greeks, because this is exactly how he sees Socrates and Plato, as living within the city, but fundamentally doing something which is different from what cities and politics do. And I would only add that since I've mentioned Socrates, who of course, like Patočka, dies at the hands of the state, Patočka almost never mentions Jesus. In fact, I can't think of a single mention of Jesus in his oeuvre, but there's a fascinating passage, which I'll discuss in my book, In Plato and Europe, where he refers to the one who comes to mind when we discuss the death of Socrates. He clearly means Jesus. So I think this is another instance of Patočka placing himself within a very particular history within which, although it's essentially philosophical, Christianity plays a decisive part.
So let's get into the text a bit more. And as this is the inaugural episode of this new series, where we'll be discussing philosophy, could you say what Patočka means by philosophy? Because it seems to have a particular meaning for him, almost as an activity, a way of life, and how that relates to his experience under totalitarian regimes.
This is an excellent question, but not a simple one. So yes, I mean, I think with some, it could kind of the cliche would be, but I think there's a lot to it, that for Patočka, philosophy is most essentially what he would call care for the soul. And he sees kind of Greco-Roman care for the soul becoming, in Christian Europe, what he calls care for the salvation of the soul. Then the question becomes, well, why is this the essence of philosophy? Because the phrase itself, care for the soul, can obscure as much as it reveals. So let me just say a couple of things on why I see this in Patočka as being such an essential concept. It seems that for him, first and foremost, philosophy begins with a posture of questioning, and he seems to think that it is the question, in a sense, which reveals to the one questioning that they stand they are in some way responsible for the process of apprehending what they're seeking. And Patočka believes that ultimately what we are seeking is the truth, which is both the truth of ourselves and the truth of what he calls the whole. So it is the question which sort of reveals us to ourselves as the sort of beings who do not have the truth of themselves or the truth of the whole in which they find themselves. And at the same time, this sense of responsibility for him reveals our freedom, because he believes that one can only feel responsibility when one is free. And so the question kind of opens both the world and our souls as a problem for us. And at the same moment, it reveals us to ourselves as beings who stand in a certain relation of freedom to the world and to ourselves. And I think that basically a conscious acceptance of this complex, that that we do not have what we're seeking, namely the truth, and that we can only seek it truthfully in light of our own freedom. I think kind of a conscious acceptance of this is what he calls philosophy.
So you've already mentioned the idea of the care for the soul, which seems to be what he identifies as the foundation of Europe, if you will. And he divides this into three parts, which he discovers in Plato and also in the pre-Socratic philosophers, but mainly in Plato. And the first type is the sort of ontocosmological care for the soul. That's to say, the place of man within the cosmos. The second one is about the place of man within the polis, within the city-state, the political activity of man. And the final one is the care for the interior soul, if you will, the soul that I am, and the being that I am. Could you say a bit more what he means by care for the soul, and why does he identify that as the foundation of Europe?
One term which I did not mention just a moment ago when I was discussing sort of the origin of philosophy as care for the soul is history. So he also believes that to live historically is not simply to be in time. To live historically is, as I was just saying, to sort of consciously accept one's responsibility for one's own destiny. He says that the soul, basically the resistance to decadence is the recognition that one is responsible for the destiny of one's own soul. And what exactly this means in different contexts, the context of ontocosmology of the city and of sort of salvation or authenticity, these are big questions we can maybe take up some other time. But really, I think the question of Europe begins with this connection between freedom and history. So he thinks that the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece, which has something to do with democracy, so not a kind of ideology of democracy, I don't think, but nevertheless, he does really see that the posture of questioning and of seeking one's the truth of one's own soul requires others to be engaged on the same venture. And so he sees the democratic city-states of ancient Greece as providing a context within which this peculiar activity, which is connected to history as such, could emerge and could sort of begin to form institutions that perdured for many centuries. So Plato's Academy, we now tend to think of Plato's Academy as a rather short-lived thing. When Plato was living in Athens, it actually lasted for almost a millennium. And there's a number of really interesting passages in the heretical essays where Patočka argues that the church is a kind of successor institution. The church is a context within which, just as in the academy, all are together concerned for care of the soul, so the church is a context within which all are together concerned for what I've already mentioned, he calls care for the salvation of the soul. And this is actually not such a kind of weird idea. I mean, I was just actually teaching here in Budapest this last week a passage from Clement of Alexandria, where he says that the Pythagorean communities, Clement in roughly the year 200 says, the ancient Pythagorean communities were a foreshadowing of the early church. So this is actually a very, very old and august idea, which Patočka develops in his own way. So I think it's this kind of constellation of freedom and history, the idea of the soul having an active and ongoing, and in some ways a quite secret and interior role to play in the life of the polis, in the life of the community, not simply accepting and transmitting the symbols and the truths or the opinions of one's community, but actually interrogating them. Patočka sees this as being kind of the seed from which Christian Europe emerges. And I would just add here, since I've talked about the difference between simply transmitting truths and interrogating them, Patočka is not, he's actually quite a critic of kind of the ideology of progress in the heretical essays, and I would say in Plato and Europe. And so he's by no means opposed to the great cultural task, which I think both of us and many others are engaged in, of transmitting the legacy of Plato and of the early church and so on and so forth. He sees himself very much as as a transmitter, right, of the cultural legacy of Europe. But what distinguishes for him myth and philosophy is that in a mythic sort of posture, one transmits unreflectively and one transmits certain symbols and dogmas and convictions and forms of life without taking responsibility for them. And as I've already said, it's questioning that awakens us to our own sense of responsibility for the truth. And so he's not at all opposing this kind of the great task of cultural memory, but he is saying that philosophy requires us to undertake this task in a very particular way, and that involves questioning. So it is he wants us to freely undertake this labor, and he sees both Platonic kind of Platonically influenced Rome, and we should not forget that Marcus Aurelius and other emperors were actually, Platonists, like real Platonists. So Platonic Rome, and then the kind of dogmatically shaped Christian Europe he sees as transmitting this task and this legacy down the centuries.
So there seems to be something that holds together this idea of European identity in Patočka's work, and it's basically Platonic thought, one might say, as you were saying. But he also says in Plato and Europe that Europe is no more, or he seems to suggest that this idea of Europe no longer exists. Is that merely because of the totalitarian regimes he was experiencing in his own life, or is there more theoretical foundation to this idea that Europe, if it's not already lost, it's about to be?
So I would first say that one of the things I find interesting about Patočka is that, as I think, our listeners would have already picked up, he sees history ultimately as being a matter of the soul. And this can sound kind of very ethereal and very naive in some sense. But when one reads the heretical essays, and he has a very interesting essay on the 19th century in Europe. And his Realpolitik reading of the 19th century is very sophisticated and very hard-headed. So I think even though Patočka is ultimately concerned with kind of, one could call them both deeper and higher matters, he is not at all incapable of looking at huge political developments in an analytic, a very serious and clear-eyed way. So why do I mention this? I think, of course, when he died in 1977, the Cold War was still very much, the Cold War structures were still very much in place. And I don't think he really foresaw, much more than anyone else did, the collapse of the Soviet Union. But why do I mention this? Because in the heretical essays, he argues that basically Russia and certain aspects of the United States represent different threats to the cultural future of Europe. So what I'm saying is, I think Patočka, and what makes him interesting as both a Cold War and a post-Cold War philosopher, is that I think had he lived to see the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he would have been alert to some of the risks that certain impulses coming from the United States were also going to bring to the European space. And not all philosophers, let's say, not all political analysts were so alert in the early 1990s, or even today. Okay, so on the one hand, I don't think he thought it was merely sort of the fascist or the communist threats which undermined Europe. I think he realized that there are threats in Europe's kind of further abroad, which which we need to continue to think about. What culturally does the United States represent in a European continental context? Okay, so but as you said, Patočka states very forthrightly, not only in Plato and Europe, but in a number of his other writings, including the heretical essays, that basically Europe is finished. He says in Plato and Europe, Europe has disappeared probably forever. So on the one hand, one could draw attention to the probably. He leaves open the possibility that the great labor of rebuilding Europe could be successful. And I think this is what many thought in the early 1990s, right? That the great labor of rebuilding Europe was going to be successful. And sadly, 30 years on, it doesn't look quite as shining and stable as we once hoped it would be. Okay, on the one hand, one could point to this and say he wasn't fatalistic. He was quite concerned, but he leaves the door open. Before I get to like a bigger answer, let me just make one point, and that is that for him, Europe had a more determinate concept than it does for most of us today. So in the heretical essays, he really argues. I've said before that Patočka rarely cites Hegel. This is one of the very rare places where Patočka is talking about Hegel. He cites an early essay by the very young Hegel, in which Hegel argues that basically it was the Crusades that created Europe. This is the young Hegel's position, which perhaps shocking to some, but Patočka more or less finds this convincing. So something about, let's say, Charlemagne's reconstitution of the Western Roman Empire, but especially the kind of the drive to the east seems to have created in Patočka's mind the first political unity of Europe. So he thinks that really it was this political unity which the two world wars destroyed irrevocably. Now, again, post-Cold War, one could maybe take issue with him and say that the EU represents some kind of new Charlemagne-like project. Okay, but let's get back to your kind of more fundamental question, which is, for one reason or another, meaning one thing or another, Patočka said repeatedly that the two world wars had destroyed Europe. I think, nevertheless, he stresses, and I'm quoting here from the same page of Plato in Europe, where he says Europe has disappeared probably forever. He also says, but through many catastrophes, its heritage is kept alive. And I think for those of us who are reading him 50 years later in much altered circumstances, it's useful for us both strategically, but also, I guess you could say, spiritually or energetically, psychologically, to keep these questions in mind as related but distinct. And that is the future of Europe and the future of the heritage of Europe. Because for Patočka, if care for the soul in this Greco-Roman Christian sense is what created the great flourishing of Europe, this is kind of, and if ultimately this heritage is simply the recognition of freedom, a freedom for truth, which he realized in his own way in first Nazi-occupied, then communist-occupied Prague, leading to his death, right? If we recognize this, then we can both strive in various ways to preserve or to restore the Europe which he saw as really collapsing after 1945, or between 1940 and 1945, 1914 and 1945. We can strive for this restoration, but we can also recognize that, at least in Patočka's mind, the task of philosophy, the task of the Platonic Christian legacy, the innermost heritage of Europe, is something that has always been, even in the era of the Crusades and European exploration and so on and so forth, it has always been ultimately a far more kind of secret and interior process. and that is the heritage. So we can fight in our own way to keep the heritage alive, in a sense, regardless of what happens to the political realization of the ancient culture he belongs to, and we try to belong to.
I think that's all the time we had for this time, but I think that's a perfect note to end on, a very positive note that there is hope for restoring the Platonic heritage, Platonic Christian heritage of Europe. Thank you so much for your time, and we might have to revisit this because there's so much more in Patočka, and I am really looking forward to reading your book once it's out, and I'm sure all our listeners will be reading it as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much.